So kia ora everyone, my name is Karen or Kaz Young from the Petone Community Board. As you can see in that image, there's this beautiful historic view of Jackson Street, Petone, which is quite a different scene to what it is today. And I thought I'd kind of start there because of that stark contrast in many ways, but I will continue on and hopefully. So, ko waio. Born and bred into Aotearoa Hut City to Chinese migrants, so I consider myself to be a Chiwi, Chinese Kiwi. I'm super passionate about justice, particularly in social, environmental and trade justice, and continue to find ways to live that out in every way possible. My background is in youth and community development work, something I've been involved with for the last 15 or so years. I work in retail, hospitality and admin, and volunteer with a number of different groups and institutions, predominantly across the city here in the Hut. I'm a food lover, whether that be on the making, providing or consuming front. As of 2016, I'm also a Petone Community Board member. So my little disclaimer is this is coming from me rather than from the board as such. And the community board area within the Hut City Council stretches from the Western Hills of Korokoro, covering all of Petone, across the river towards the Eastern Hills, which includes Moera, Gracefield, Seaview, and the southern parts of Waipatu and Woburn South. This area was historically the Petone borough and therefore had its own council. Now, you might be wondering why I have this photo, other than the fact that it's quite fitting of our temperatures. This was a photo back in August 2016 up at Mount Climby, when in the 11th hour I decided to run in the local elections, not expecting to actually get elected, but to shake up the kōrero. As someone who rents, relies on public transport and my feet to get around, works in multiple part-time jobs and spends a good deal of time in local community and networks, and refuse to give in to traditional means of campaigning, as well as the obvious nature that I'm someone who is of a younger demographic, a woman and of Chinese heritage, perspectives that don't often are seen around the table. So a huge part of me being involved kind of happened unexpectedly. But I share this with you because I think this is important by way of the context of where we are, what next, and because I think elections is a great time to get more progressive voices out there, especially by way of active transport and a more wholesome sort of vision. So, Petone. Settlers arrived on Petone Beach on the 22nd of January 1840, so one of the first settlements in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and now it has a population of roughly 8,000 or so people. We talk a lot about it being the jewel of the crown, proudly in Petone, because there is so much going on there. So many eateries, restaurants, cafes, full of retail and industry in the pockets of side streets as well as on the main street. It's full of amenities. So we've got a library, supermarkets, we've got the banks, postal services. It's kind of one of those places with a lot going on for it. And I want to hone into Jackson Street. So many people have talked about it being the new Ponsonby. I don't know if I'd see that necessarily as a positive or a negative, but it has fielded a lot of different comparisons across the country. But I actually think it's a place full of potential. And I want to hone on these two concepts. So we talk a bit about the 15-minute city. So this idea that you can walk or you can cycle in the space of 15 minutes within the area that you're in. And for many people, I'd actually say Petone fits that really well because it has a number of schools, it's got all those different amenities, and it's quite flat, so easy to get around in. But then I also want to throw in this concept of 880. So for those that haven't heard about it, the idea of a place is suitable for an 8-year-old as much as it is suitable for an 80-year-old. And I think, again, this is something that we haven't quite grasped where we are, and it's something that I think if we started to grasp that a bit more, we might actually see people a bit more open to travelling on foot rather than being in their cars. I want to talk a little bit about public transport in Jackson Street as well. So for those that don't know, Jackson Street's quite a busy sort of street. Hundreds of different businesses operate from it. But it's also got great access to public transport. So it's got two main bus routes that run very frequently, every 15 or so minutes, as well as the 83, which goes from Eastbourne through the Lower Hutt CBD, through Petone, and then out to Wellington City and back. And so it's quite heavily, I guess, used for commuters as well. And then also just down the end of Jackson Street, it's topped off by the railway station, which again also has multiple services connected to it. So it's a place that is easy for people to get around on public transport if they chose to do so. And one of those learnings that I've kind of had in the space of being quite active on Jackson Street, so as someone who uses it quite regularly, but also someone who works down it, I've also found a lot of people have struggled with our footpaths, for instance, and that's been an issue of concern for a number of people. When I got onto the community board, one of the things I learned very, very quickly was how big a conversation parking and congestion were going to be for the next few years of my life. Never would I think I would learn so much about parking in a year than I did in my first year of being an elected member. And as you would have seen in that first image, very few cars. And actually, if you look at some historical images of Jackson Street, you went from hardly any cars to parallel parking to angled parking. And now there's quite some interesting challenges with that corridor. And then congestion has obviously gotten worse over time as more people get into their cars, but also one of the key things in Petone that we've seen in the last few years is the development of big box retailers and the knock-on effects of how people then decide to travel through the main street in order to avoid some of that traffic, and then the hold-ups of just more people being out and about. And so those two things, as well as conversations around intensifying our housing stock as well within our area, has added to further tension with around parking and congestion. And that's one of the ongoing challenges for us. When I was invited to speak about how we are and where we are at the moment, we had just kind of gotten into the throes of innovating streets as well. So the Hutt City Council had put forward two different proposals through Waka Kotahi NZTA with innovating streets, and one of them happened to be on Jackson Street. Unfortunately, it wasn't successful, and from there was a lot of big learnings. I think although there were some parts of it that missed the mark completely, there was a lot of good learnings that I think will lead us into good stead into the future. But with innovating streets, a huge part of that was around getting funding to, I guess, springboard off the dynamic of COVID and seeing how the place became a place where people could walk and cycle more and get around through active means of transport rather than just being in their cars. And Jackson Street's quite an interesting beast with many tensions and many different things to hold. And it's a place where I think we haven't really had as much of a vision around what things could be. And I guess that's why I want to lead into this next bit around where to next. And a huge part of that, your image here is a photo of the Petone Rotary Fair. And this is held every year in February, which brings thousands of people into the street who are fairly happy to get around the city and the event, not in a car. And one of my visions is seeing parts of our city, particularly like spaces like Jackson Street, being more people-friendly, rather than full of congested and parked cars. So often I'm left with that question around how do we celebrate things like this and work off that and springboard off it to create those wins. And part of that, I think, is we need a new vision that excites people and that doesn't just get thrown about with all the fears and the challenges, especially around transition, because we know the devil's often in the detail and it's harder to transition. Once we're actually at that changed point, a lot of us are celebrating it and relishing in it, but that in-between time can be the most challenging time. But it also brings conversations together and gets people out of the current working silos because, as kind of mentioned previously, the number of people who often work in their own pockets, but when we start realising how connected they all are, that's when we can really see some good changes. I think that it also helps us having courageous conversations, and that allows us to socialise and develop new ways of thinking and being which should then lead to some cultural and behavioural change, which for here also fits into the development of our integrated transport strategy, as well as our city climate change response and our local spatial vision of Petone 2040, which kind of encourages a different way of doing and being. Some of the things that we need to support that is stats and facts, especially within our own Aotearoa context. So I think the idea of being able to share the facts that we see and the things that we learn in our own spaces and sharing that with other territorial authorities is really helpful, because often when we only bring up examples, I think from offshore, it becomes quite challenging for people to relate to that. And that proximity is a bit too far from some. So I think if we can bring in stats and facts that become a bit more relevant and easier for people to understand and grasp because they may have seen it, we can really start to see some changes. And finally, I think about this quote from Dr. Kate Marvel, who actually said this in regards to climate change action about having courage and not hope. For me, this is so important because it talks about leadership. We need the community leadership as much as the political leadership. And with local elections coming around the corner, I think it is important for walking active transport advocates to be engaging, whether that be running to get onto the table to make those decisions, whether it be to rub shoulders with the people who will be at the table making those decisions, or to shake up the kōrero in general, simply by asking questions and keeping people accountable. I think that stuff is really important because we need people to be operating on different levels if we want to see that big change that allows a number of us to get to the vision that we want to see. And I want to end with this quote. After a day's walk, everything has twice its usual value, because often when we're moving at a slower pace, we see more, we engage more, and I thought it was really beautiful to see Vesta and Petone often in wherever they're based, they often take their young people, their tamariki, for walks around their local hood. And it's when young people develop that sense of pride and community by being able to connect well with others so locally. I think that's where we help pass on that vision. And yeah, I think that's something that we can all do in our own respective spaces that will hopefully lead to some great change in the future.